श्री स्वामीनारायण भगवाननी जय। अक्षर पुरुषोत्तम महाराजनी जय। गुणातीतानंद स्वामी महाराजनी जय। राधा कृष्ण देवनी जय। सियावर रामचंद्र भगवाननी जय। उमापति महादेवनी जय। भगत जी महाराजनी जय। शास्त्री जी महाराजनी जय। योगी जी महाराजनी जय। प्रमुख स्वामी महाराजनी जय। महंत स्वामी महाराजनी जय। प्रमुख स्वामी महाराज शताब्दी महोत्सवनी जय। Welcome to this week's episode of Timeless Hindu Wisdom. Last week, we examined the act of prayer. We spoke a little about its potential for a unique form of courage. A brief examination in contrast between Yudhisthira and Arjuna, two of the brave warriors from the Mahabharata, will help shed light on the value of this courage. Though they shared similar life experiences, they had divergent personal outcomes. These were exceptional human beings. It is noteworthy, however, that though they were champions amongst men, they are still accountable to the principles that brought on those outcomes. Let's go back to Draupadi's prayer and the miracle that struck fear into Dhritarastra. King Dhritarastra, who was Duryodhana's father and uncle to the Pandavas, lived a tragic life. Although he was blessed with great physical strength, he was born without any vision. And so, even though he was the eldest of 3 princes, due to his impairment, he was originally passed over in favor of his younger brother as king. He was resentful of this decision, and his eventual ascension to the throne did nothing to quell his resentment and the insecurities that were born from it. Thus, he was continually complicit in his son's heinous conspiracies against the Pandavas, even while outwardly expressing great affection for them. After the original dice game, he returned everything back to Draupadi and the Pandavas. He allowed them to return home, asking them to forget what had happened. But make no mistake, this was not chivalry or benevolence. This was an act of self-defense, a futile attempt to erase a horrendous mistake. But his petulant son did not see it that way. Incensed with his father's lack of resolve, Duryodhana demanded, implored even, his father to call back the Pandavas for another round of dice. Duryodhana knew how to get his father to comply by blaming him for allowing the Pandavas to regroup and stew in anger and thus risking their family's life. Duryodhana, whose arrogance, jealousy, and lust for revenge had now been compounded into this ravenous greed, would have benefited greatly from the company of the great poet Mirabai, who knew that the bliss that man seeks in his mindless rush or dash for wealth is actually available by surrendering oneself to God, whom she had won over. वस्तु अमोलिक दी मेरे सतगुरु, वस्तु अमोलिक दी मेरे सतगुरु, कृपा कर अपनायो, आयो जी मैंने कृपा कर अपनायो. पायो जी मैंने राम रतन धन पायो, पायो जी मैंने राम रतन धन पायो. Duryodhan, however, was not going to be deterred and not going to be convinced. And his father Dhritarastra was too weak in character to challenge his son's folly. So once more, against the wise counsel of his brother Vidur, Dhritarashtra invited Yudhisthira to a second game of dice. The Pandavas, loyal to their eldest brother, begrudgingly honored this invitation, and Yudhisthira, fully aware now of the impending doom, had seen this as his Dharma. So Duryodhana successfully cheated and won again. This time, the loss meant the Pandavas would go into exile for 14 years. If they managed to remain unrecognized during the last year of the exile, their kingdom would be returned to them. Considering the Pandavas' overwhelming superior wealth and military strength, that they would honor such devastating consequences as a result of a loaded game of dice. Clearly, this was a very different time. But anyway, 14 years went by. Too fast for Duryodhana and his father, apparently, because, the Pandavas returned and rightfully wanted their kingdom. Now, during that time, Dhritarashtra once called his wise brother Vidur. He valued his wisdom, at least enough that he found it entertaining. He told him about the trouble he was having sleeping. A virtuous, brilliant, and wise, Vidurji told his brother, "Sleep leaves those who steal, those who are lustful, those who have lost their wealth, and those who have failed to achieve success, or those who are weak and have been attacked by a stronger foe. I hope, dear brother, that these calamities have not befallen you. I hope you haven't been overtaken by grief resulting from coveting wealth belonging to someone else." Dhritarashtra was mesmerized by Vidur's wisdom and intricate understanding of Dharma. And as Vidurji eviscerated Dhritarashtra's decisions, he also praised Yudhishthira's patience and honor. And this was news to no one. Everyone in the Kuru house was aware of Yudhishthira's exceptional adherence to Dharma. The sages of the Vedic tradition cherished scientific inquiry. They studied the cosmos, they studied the natural world, they developed technologies to improve the quality of life. But these sages were also well versed in philosophy, meditation, and introspection. Though they marveled at the many wonders they discovered, they did not lose sight of the fact that everything they studied had a lifespan. They saw clearly that the perceivable world and everything that sustains it, by its very nature, slowly but inevitably, deteriorates into a form of chaos or disorder. They didn't fear this fact, nor did they surrender themselves to fate. They considered the purpose for this design. They accepted the entropic nature of creation and made monumental efforts to understand the interdependencies that could foster prolonged sustenance through order and harmony. These sages helped formulate systems that promoted duty, morality, ethics, and virtue in individuals and communities and societies and governing bodies, all meant to maintain order and to allow for life. Collectively, these systems in practice are what we refer to when we use the word Dharma. Now, there are elements to Dharma that are universal, elements that are specific to time and place, and elements that are specific to individuals. This is why knowing Dharma, and even more importantly, living a dharmic life, is essential. Dharma lessens our contribution to the deterioration of society and world that sustains us. More specifically, It allows for the attainment of wealth and worldly fulfillment without further detriment to one's spiritually inclined pursuits. But perfecting Dharma is no small task. In chapter 6, verse 92, the Manusmriti lists 10 characteristics that identify the presence of Dharma. 1. Patient persistence. 2. Forgiveness. 3. Self-discipline. 4. Abstinence from all forms of theft at every level. 5. Purity. 6. Control over the senses. 7. Discretion, or the ability to decipher true and false. 8. Knowledge, particularly of one's true identity as a soul. 9. Honesty. And 10. The absence of anger. That is to say, Yudhisthira's accomplishments in the field of Dharma were no small achievement. But as outstanding as it wasn't the end-all. On the eve of the 9th day of the Mahabharata war, Bhisma listened to Duryodhana's vague taunts and complaints that his grandfather didn't care for him because he refused to kill the Pandavas. Self-absorbed as he was, Duryodhana remained completely unaware of Bhishma's self-sacrifice for the sake of his grandson's unjust cause. Resentful as ever, Bhishma responded to his grandson in gentle words, promising that tomorrow he would fight in a way he never had before. And Bhishma lived up to this promise. No one could slow him down. He was a terror, wreaking havoc upon the Pandav army. By the end of that day, the Pandav camp was shook. All anyone spoke about was how terrible Bhishma had been and how there didn't seem any chance to win as long as he fought. Yudhisthira was full of sorrow. He was ready to stop fighting and return to his forest exile. He cursed himself for all of the sorrow he had brought upon his family, his friends, and everyone who had taken up his cause. All of this was in response to what he had witnessed in Bhishma that day against his army. Though he was very different from his cousin Duryodhana, Yudhisthira would have done just as well to have had Mirabai's company. तेरी मिट जाए सब शंका चिंता मिट जाए सब शंका चिंता नाम हरि का बोल रे नाम हरि का बोल रे तू छोड़ दे तू छोड़ दे तू छोड़ दे अब मन मानी रे प्राणी जो सुख लेना मोल रे नाम हरि का बोल रे काहे फरे तू ढीले हाले झूठी माया के मत वाले झूठी माया के मत वाले काहे फरे तू ढीले हाले झूठी माया के मत वाले झूठी माया के मत वाले पीले प्रेम पियाला रे प्राणी पीले प्रेम पियाला रे प्राणी हरि नाम अनमोल रे हरि नाम अनमोल रे नाम हरि का बोल रे नाम हरि का बोल रे। तेरी मिट जाए सब शंका चिंता, नाम हरि का बोल रे, नाम हरि का बोल रे. Krishna calmed Yudhisthira. He reminded him that Krishna was still on his side. And though he had promised not to take up weapons in this war, he was not going to allow the Pandavas to lose. If he had to, he himself will kill Bhisma if Arjuna wouldn't. This sort of moment brought Yudhisthira back to his senses. And they all decided that it would be a good idea to go to Bhisma himself and ask him how they could defeat him, or in other words, how they can kill him. Bhisma welcomed the Pandavas that night lovingly when they showed up at his camp. His love for his grandchildren overflowed, and Yudhisthira was choked with tears, explaining his plight and how he hated himself for what he had done. And then he asked his beloved grandfather, I hate that I am a warrior, I hate this war, but I must win it. And for that to happen, I must see you killed. I must know how it can be done. Dear grandfather, how can we kill you on the battlefield? These words came to the ears of Bhisma as if it were the sweetest music he had ever heard. He warned that only Arjuna or Krishna could ever kill him. He went into minute detail on how they should create the diversion that would force him to drop his weaponry and leave him vulnerable to Arjuna's arrows. Now, the tenderness of this moment cannot be overstated. Though these were grown men, openly discussing violence and mortality, they had become like small children seeing their beloved grandfather after years of separation. Bhisma, in fact, had Arjuna, who Arjuna himself was soon to be an expectant grandfather. He didn't even know this. Arjuna sat on Bhisma's lap. Bhisma had Arjuna sit on his lap while explaining to him how to defeat him. And while Arjuna buried his head into his grandfather's chest in sadness, Bhisma consoled him. This was the happiest Bhisma had been in a long time. He told the Pandavas that he longed for this freedom. Krishna smiled and promised him that he shall have his release. And so, when the Pandavas left, Arjuna, who was dejected, voiced his hesitation one last time to Krishna. And with a quick reality check, Krishna laid his worries to rest. Arjuna, now free from his sadness, was ready to meet the need of the moment. And on the 10th day of the war, the very next day, exactly as his grandfather had explained, Arjuna killed Bhisma on the battlefield. Now, Yudhisthira was a different story. He had recognized what needed to be done. He is the one who actually asked his grandfather for the means to killing him. Yudhisthira had always chosen the honorable route. After all, the Mahabharata recognizes Yudhisthira as an exemplar of Dharma. But this did nothing to remove the burden of such difficult decisions on his heart. Despite being famed for his wisdom and virtue, Yudhisthira could not overcome the moral ambiguity brought on by the circumstances he faced in life. Praise, consolation, or even the blessings of those he venerated, nothing could alleviate the grief and anxiety he experienced after the war. So, although Yudhisthira had faith in the Shastras, he could not free himself from the conflict arising from his own interpretations. He needed to understand the root of his grief. He needed someone to free him from the ignorance fueling his misinterpretations. Yudhisthira suffered self-doubt even though he won the war. Even though he triumphed over his enemies. Even though justice, after all the years of waiting, had finally been served. But most tragically, Yudhisthira suffered even though he was clearly on the right side, even though Krishna swore to protect him. All he had to do was to surrender to Krishna, who he had already recognized as God. Somehow, Yudhisthira could not see beyond his personal grief, even though the solution to his problem was so close by. This is what made Arjuna special. Arjuna had leveraged his practice of Dharma. It won favor from Krishna in the form of affection, and Arjuna in turn saw in Krishna his best friend, his mentor, his teacher, his guru, and his savior. शाश्वत सुख ने शांति पमाड़े निर्भय करे स्वामी शरणो तमारो शाश्वत सुख ने शांति पमाड़े निर्भय करे स्वामी शरणो तमारो हाथ ग्रहीने भव जड़ तारी हाथ ग्रहीने भव जड़ तारी लई जाए श्री जी ने समीप लई जाए श्री जी ने समीप लई जाए श्री जी ने समीप श्री जी चरण मां शीश नमावी हूँ तो गाऊं स्वामी तव गीत गाऊं प्रमुख स्वामी तव गीत. At the beginning, the war weighed heavily on Arjuna, perhaps even more so than his older brother. However, Arjuna found courage from his faith in Krishna by means of complete surrender to Krishna. This courage allowed him to exercise Dharma independent of petty motivations. Krishna's refuge allowed Arjuna to feel peace during the most turbulent time in his life. The resulting trust allowed Arjuna to function at the full capacity of his potential when he was ready to give up. It gave him the clarity to discern right from wrong amidst the most ambiguous circumstances. Next week, we will examine a key moment at the beginning of Arjuna's journey to winning God's trust. Namaste. Jai Swaminarayan.